Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Adey. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Intern here with SISG's Alliance for Positive Youth Development. We are so happy that you all can join us today and how we learn how we can support youth in this mental health crisis. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy that happened in Texas because it impacts all of us that work with youth and children. Sadly, our BIPOC youth experience gun violence at significantly higher rates. It's important that we discuss their mental health and well-being, and hopefully today's webinar can help you promote mental health in your field. Attendees, you are muted, so if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we will answer them towards the end of the webinar. Today, we have 3 mental health leaders and advocates from the Children's Partnership with us. They are Angela, Alexis, and Hermela. I'll give them the platform to introduce themselves and start the presentation. Again, welcome all.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. One quick second, I'm going to share my screen.
While Alexis is pulling that up, Angela, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Angela Vasquez, and I am from the Children's Partnership. I am the Policy Director over mental health. I work with Alexis, and I'm excited today for you all to meet Hermela. Hermela is actually a youth leader that we have been working with on this project that you will hear about today. I can also share a little bit about our organization. So the Children's Partnership, oh, there we go. I'll pause and let Alexis.
So sorry about that, guys.
No, that's okay.
Awesome. We just want to first start off. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here, as these past couple of weeks have been deemed grief-filled and heart-wrenching, and showing up for yourself today and every day in this time should be commended. So I just wanted to start off by saying that. And thank you so much, Angela, for getting us started. Today, we're going to be presenting on the youth-centered strategies for hope, healing, and health. But before we get started, Hi guys, sorry. I'm not able to move to the next screen. Oh, there we are. Sorry, guys. I just wanted to kind of first talk about who we are as an organization. So I want to share some of the missions and visions that TCP holds. And so the Children's Partnership is a California-based children's advocacy organization. And we advance the child's health equity through public policy, community engagement, and research. So we envision a California where all children, no matter their background, that they have the resources and opportunities that they need to thrive and be healthy. So since 1993, TCP has been the leading voice for children and a critical resource for communities across California. TCP seeks to dismantle racism that is embedded in our social, economic, and political system, and the structures that are created to perpetuate this persistent inequities that shape the outcomes and lives and the trajectories of the California's children. All of our policy priorities center the experiences of marginalized children and families, and we recognize the importance that it has on so many facets of life, and that the path towards equity in any form must include a path towards health and for children. So that's a bit about our organization. Let me move on to the next slide. And a quick intro, I'm Alexis Martin. I'm the policy associate here at the Children's Partnership. I'm on the mental health team, and I'll let my colleague Angela introduce herself again.
Hi, everyone. Like I said, my name is Angela Vasquez, and I'm the policy director over mental health here at the Children's Partnership. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And just wanted to share that I and Alexis are social workers by training. And so we, I think, are very excited to be able to bring our social work expertise into children's public policy and advocacy. And with that, I will turn it over to Hermela to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Hermela Goshu, and I'm with the H3 Collective representing Justice for Black Girls. I'm currently a college student in Chicago at DePaul University, and I'm hoping to work in the field of pediatrics, and I want to advocate for children's health. So Yeah.
Thanks so much, Hermela.
Thank you so much. So now we just kind of want to get into the impacts of COVID-19, how it affected children and the whole child perspective. So COVID-19 not only affected the safe housing and stable housing for children, but it also affected the quality of childcare and early education, nutritious foods, the mental and physical care of children, as well as economic stable families and trusted caregivers. So nationally, before COVID-19, in 2019, nearly 50% of youth who were severely impaired with a major depressive episode did not receive treatment. We also want to highlight that Black and Latinx children were about 14% less likely than white children to receive treatment for their depression overall. And though as likely to have a major depressive episode as white children, they were less likely to receive treatment in inpatient settings. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for Native youth and nearly 3.5 times higher than the national average, and higher than any other ethnic group. High school girls across all races and ethnicities have made plans to attempt suicide more than boys. A little bit more, Black and Latina girls represent a distinct group of young women whose gender and racial or ethnic background intersect in ways that contribute increased exposure to chronic stressors and traumatic experiences and simultaneously create barriers to accessing hope, health, and healing. So Black and Latina girls were nearly twice as likely to attempt suicide as Black and Latina boys. And Black girls are 6 times as likely to be suspended and 4 times as likely to be arrested at school than white girls. And this is from the National Black Women's Justice Institute. Black girls are also experience disproportionate levels of other type of gender-based enforcement and discipline, such as being suspended or removed from the class because of dress code violations and being disruptive, and other euphemisms for being too adult-like. Another stat is over half of Latina girls are worried about a friend or family member being deported, and nearly a quarter have been harassed because of their family name or country of origin. To continue, 22% of girls had seriously considered suicide and nearly 12% had attempted suicide, and this is from the CDC. LGBTQ plus youth from American Indian and Alaskan Native backgrounds were 2.5 times more likely to report a suicide attempt in the past year compared to their non-Native LGBTQ plus peers. Youth are in small, rural, and hard to reach communities such as Native communities experience comparable stressors to those of their Black and urban-based peers, such as financial hardship, negative views of the mental health system, and school supports. And they have a preference for supports from peers and adults with similar experiences. This is the impacts of immigration policy on children's mental health. So the Children's Partnership released the effect of hostile immigration policies on children's mental health. And just to give a brief overview of the literature, it showed that family separation harms children's mental and physical health, children of undocumented parents at risk of behavioral problems, having parents taken away undermines family economic security. And we also see that climate of fear further restricts children's access to education, public benefits, and other services. We also have a fact sheet. This was from 2021, but a Latinx children fact sheet. And we just wanted to talk about some of the mental health disparities that affect Latinx youth. So Latinas in particular are facing the greatest disparity when it comes to their mental health. 62% of Latina teens felt chronic sadness or hopelessness in the last year. 34% of Latina teens have considered suicide, and 13% have attempted suicide, compared to 27% and 9% of all school youth, respectively. I know these are a lot of stats, but it's really important that we take these numbers in. For lesbian, bisexual, and queer Latina youth, the reality is even worse. Nearly 48% have considered suicide, and 33% of lesbians, bisexual, and queer Latinas have attempted suicide. We also want to talk about policing and its harmful impacts on child well-being. The Children's Partnership also released a brief called Policing and its Harmful Impacts on Child Well-Being. And just to give a quick overview of the literature, it says that policing disproportionately impacts BIPOC, children and youth. And the exposure to violence is an adverse childhood experience, and 61% of Black children, 51% of Latinx children, and 40% of white children have at least one adverse childhood experience. BIPOC children and youth who report discrimination display more mental health symptoms, and direct and vicarious exposure to police violence, including immigration enforcement, are contributors to toxic stress. Black children's mental health. We also released this past February a Black children's health fact sheet. And in this fact sheet, you can see that the orange line, from the screen, what's here on this chart, what you can see is the orange line goes up from 2019 to 2020. Young Black men and Black boys have historically had a higher suicide rate in general. What we want to note is between 2019 and 2020, suicide rate for Black boys and Black men went down, and it actually increased for Black girls and Black women. This can also be seen on this, the gender differences. Dr. Tammy Benton, who is the chief psychiatrist and chair of the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences in Philadelphia, stated in a webinar that suicide rates for Black girls have increased by more than double that of Black boys. We know that risk factors for suicide for Black youth are connected to systemic racism. These include neighborhood violence, economic insecurity, ACEs, as we just previously mentioned, and historical trauma. These traumas are also more prevalent and severe when compared to children of other racial and ethnic groups. Exposures to traumatic videos that are online have also contributed to toxic stress, traumatic experiences, as well as depression. Dr. Igwe also cited that it's been linked to suicide rates among Black and Latinx youth. While this data can be hard to bear, I just want you to know that we provide protective factors, and protective factors are a way in which to kind of alleviate some of these symptoms against suicide for Black youth. And Dr. Igwe and Dr. Benton also mentioned that some of these protective factors include familiar supports, school connectedness, high level of racial and ethnic identification, and stable finances. As there is not a lot of research surrounding what interventions exist to reduce such rates occurring in the Black youth population, it's important that we continue to put this data out there and it is known so research can be done. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Angela.
Thanks, Alexis. What you have heard over the last several slides from Alexis is that, community trauma is exceptionally prevalent in communities of color. And while the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis was absolutely global and affected everyone in some way, that kind of trauma, like many of our traumas and stressors, is not felt evenly across communities. So I did want to direct your attention to a couple of recent articles that were published that showed community violence really has strong impacts on mental health outcomes of Black people and people from marginalized communities. And this was really, these types of disparities in racial and ethnic mental health outcomes is really what sort of informed the work that I'm about to talk to you about today. So next slide. So again, as you've heard, we at the Children's Partnership really believe that positive experiences matter. And so it was really important for us in exploring the mental health outcomes of youth of color, LGBTQ youth, and girls, that we try to uncover not just what were challenges and barriers and things that they were dealing with and grappling with, but that also we tried to uncover solutions and what things made them feel well and healthy and centered. And so I think this is also really important because we can very easily get mired in a lot of the negative, and it's really important that we uplift protective factors and try to put policies in place that promote a strengths-based approach. Next slide. So we established the Children's Partnership together with the National Black Women's Justice Institute, pulled together 15 organizations from across the US who represented largely community-based organizations, youth development organizations who were serving high school age youth of color. These groups, like I said, were not traditional mental health service providers. However, in all of their applications and all of their work that they are doing in their communities, it's absolutely mental health work. It is therapeutic, if not direct therapy. And so these 15 organizations each put forward a youth leader. And those 15 youth leaders were really the center of the work that we did together over the next year. We called ourselves the Hope, Healing, and Health Collective, or H3C. Next. And so together with our 15 youth leaders, we hosted and co-facilitated listening sessions with 40 of their peers. Our youth leaders invited their friends, their peers in their program to come and really talk about their mental health, barriers to receiving mental health care, again, what things made them feel well, what did they want to see in their schools, what did they want therapy to look like and feel like. We also really wanted to understand the impacts of their family and their culture and their racial identity on their experiences. Again, both their positive experiences with the mental health system and maybe negative experiences as well. Next slide. And I will turn it over to Hermela to chat a little bit about her experience being one of our H3C youth leaders.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. Hi, everyone. Like I said earlier, my name's Hermela Goshu, and I was representing Justice for Black Girls in the H3 Collective. Also, just a quick disclaimer, internet is not going well for me right now, so I cannot turn my camera on, but I apologize for that. But yeah, so being a part of the H3C Collective was really, really cool. And it was an amazing experience because I got to see the perspectives of different youth all over the country and what their lived experience was like. I think oftentimes when we see statistics and facts about mental health in marginalized communities, we tend to kind of make it some sort of monolith in our head. But seeing across the board how different everyone's experiences were was really interesting and really eye-opening. While I do think disparities existed across the board, what they looked like and how they made the youth feel were drastically different between each group of people and each person even. So it was very eye-opening to get to see what everybody else's school systems look like, what everybody else's access to mental health care look like, and in general, just be able to bounce ideas off of one another and kind of come together to describe what our ideal situations would look like and what we would like to see as a group improved across the board when it comes to mental health services. And so it was just very interesting to see, first of all, how different it was, and I'll speak on that a little. I'm from Denver, Colorado, and we have mental health services available through our schooling system. These mental health systems that are available are not culturally competent or aware. So for BIPOC youth to access them, it is harder and almost kind of, I don't want to say less valuable, but it doesn't address the need that is there always. So it can make it harder to use those services for what they're needed for. But some of the other youth that I spoke to In the program, they did not have any mental health services at their school or anything of the sort. So to see kind of the fluctuation in that, and some people were like, oh, well, we have a social worker, but that's about it. To see the difference in that was really interesting for me. But yeah, it was very nice to see how well informed and ready to fight against these institutions that my fellow students were, because I think it was easy for all of us to recognize that a disparity does exist and that we should have access to mental health services, but most of us didn't. And so to see how ready people were to mobilize their communities and work with their communities to dispel kind of any negative stigma around mental health and all of these different things. It was very interesting. And I really do like being a part of my generation, because I think that we are really ready to deal with some of the systemic issues that we face. But yeah, it was very eye-opening to see how everybody was kind of, not only what their lived experiences were, but their interpretations of every situation as well.
Thanks so much, Sharmila. And it was so great to have you as part of our collective work. I think you really brought an exceptional insight into not just your own experiences, but you were able to talk about your experiences as they related to others, made sort of great inferences and shared some insights from your community. So again, I think this is for folks on our webinar today. I think one of the important takeaways is that young people absolutely can and should be part of program planning, policy advocacy. You know, they are hungry to not just talk about these issues, but be part of brainstorming solutions to the challenges that they identify. Next slide. So quickly going to introduce a short video. Wanted to show this video mostly for you all to get a sense of the kinds of conversations that our H3C leaders had amongst each other in planning the listening session, and then the kinds of conversations that they had in the listening sessions themselves. So you can go ahead and play the video, Alexis.
Mental illness can affect anyone. Mental health affects how we feel, think, and act. It's important at every stage of life so that we can cope with stressful situations, work productively, and make meaningful contributions to our community. However, the statistics are staggering. Over 45% of teens suffer from a mental disorder, and 1 in 5 teens suffer from a severe mental illness. That's 20% of our teen population. Mental illnesses are brain function disorders. They have many causes and result from complex interactions between a person's genes and their environment. A person struggling with mental health should not be viewed any different than if someone were experiencing a physical illness. Mental illness is not a choice or a failure. It does not discriminate. It can affect anyone, regardless of age, gender, social status, ethnicity, or any other aspect of cultural identity. In fact, mental illnesses occur at similar rates around the world, in every culture and in all socioeconomic groups. The concern with mental health isn't just about the statistics, it's about well-being. It can affect families, friends, and our communities. But you can help make a difference by learning to recognize the signs of mental illness. A mental illness makes the things you do in life hard, like work, school, and socializing. It's also not always clear when a problem with mood or thinking has become serious enough to be a concern. Sometimes a depressed mood is normal, such as when a person experiences the loss of a loved one. But if that depressed mood continues to cause distress or gets in the way of normal daily functioning, the person may benefit from professional care. If you think you or someone you know might be struggling with their mental health, it is best to consult a professional. Early identification and effective treatment is key to treating a disorder and preventing future disability. A healthcare professional will connect symptoms and experiences to help formulate a diagnosis. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people between 10 to 24. If you're thinking about suicide, are worried about a friend or loved one, or would like emotional support, call 1-800-273-8255.
Thank you. So, as I said, after engaging with our youth leaders and their peers through our series of listening sessions, we came together to try to start uplifting and putting together some themes, as well as, again, like I said, solutions to some of the issues that we identified in the listening sessions. So, one group, sort of one theme that we heard a lot about in our listening sessions from young people was around access to quality care. What that meant to young people is that there was a lack of diversity among mental health professionals. They were largely white and from middle or upper socioeconomic status communities. There is a high cost to quality services, and there is limited uptake of virtual services. Telehealth, talking to a therapist on video chat, etc. And so the solutions to these issues were several. So in particular, the youth said that we should increase the number of mental health professionals who reflect their race, ethnicity, and culture. We should increase youth access to and knowledge of mental health insurance benefits. We need to ensure that youth can access confidential care without parent consent or notification. This was really important for all youth, but in particular for youth, LGBTQ youth, as well as youth whose families had a lot of stigma as it relates to mental health and mental illness. We also need to lower the cost of mental health services for youth and their families. Things like copays, things like transportation costs, etc. There are a lot of costs related to accessing care, even if you have access to health insurance. We also need to ensure that youth have in-person and telehealth options. We heard a lot about Zoom fatigue, screen fatigue for young people, and the idea of needing to be on camera to talk to a therapist from your bedroom, which is a very, can be a very private place for anyone. I think was challenging for young people. And that being said, many young people really liked the convenience of being able to talk to their therapist, from their bedroom, from their laptop. There were also a lot of comments about having access to good internet, having access to technology in order to access telehealth and telemental health services. So we really need to make sure that the options, a wide array of options are available for young people. Next slide. Another bucket of themes that we identified with young people is that there is a limited scope of available mental health services. What that really means is that youth honestly identified that their culture and cultural practices and positive racial and ethnic identity development were healing in of themselves. And this relates to another sort of issue that they identified, is that there is really just an overemphasis in their mind on clinical mental health interventions. And so what we heard pretty loud and clear from our young people is that we should really expand our definition of what we consider a mental health intervention. This includes youth development programs, racial and ethnic affinity practices, civic engagement, advocacy, protest. There is something really special and important about becoming an advocate for an issue that you care about, and even more so if that issue is directly related to your community. And so these positive experiences are incredibly healing for youth from marginalized communities. And again, a related solution to that is that we really need to build the capacity of youth themselves to support each other. So peer support is an evidence-based mental health intervention that is not honestly well-resourced for adults, and it is even less resourced for young people and high school and middle school age youth, but it can work. And so we, again, as advocates, need to properly resource youth peer support programs and models, because this is really where the healing between young people is going to take place, is in community with each other. Next slide. There was, again, a lot of talk about family, race, and culture and how it impacts both positively and negatively young people's mental health. So there was a lot of, honestly, mistrust across the mental health system of adults who are mostly white, of teachers. Young people really expressed a lot of skepticism and fear over divulging information with mental health professionals or other adults for a variety of reasons. They were afraid of the therapist breaking confidentiality. Black and Native youth in particular were especially afraid of having something they say be reported to child welfare, to child protective services. And Latinx youth were very afraid about sharing immigration status or immigration concerns. Again, because they were afraid that they were going to be, they were going to put their families in trouble or at risk. And so we really, these policies sort of here in blue really try to combat a lot of the cultural stigma, and as well as try to break down some of the systemic barriers and really systemic racism within the mental health system and in the public education system, to really provide better access to services for young people who have really legitimate concerns about engaging with the mental health system. All right, next slide. I want to make sure that we leave time for some questions. And so our last two sort of buckets of themes that we discussed with young people were around school-based services. There really were not sufficient resources at schools, which is where young people felt safest and where services could be most accessible if there were enough counselors, if there were enough social workers. Many youth talked about how there's one school counselor for an entire high school, which is not feasible to receive, ongoing care or establish a relationship with that counselor. Another piece, again, and I mentioned this before, youth are really eager and prepared to be thought partners in policy advocacy in program development. They are the experts in their experiences and really should be leaders with schools, with youth development programs, and with policymakers about identifying solutions that work for their mental health needs. Next slide. One thing I did want to share to sort of bring the point home, especially around sort of expanding what we consider a mental health intervention, is that there is data to suggest, well, first let me back up. Suicide in Native youth is exceptionally high compared to other racial and ethnic groups. And there's evidence to suggest that youth, or that communities whose youth participated in the Standing Rock protest, their communities experienced a reduction in Native youth suicide. And what that really tells me, and I think should tell policymakers, is that protest advocacy, that coming together with your community by developing a positive sense of your racial identity is a protective factor. This was an exceptionally difficult protest. It was violent, it was scary, and I think you could argue that it was not necessarily ultimately effective. And at the same time, those communities experienced a tangible benefit from speaking truth to power. Their youth felt empowered and more well, and we see that in the reduction in the suicide rate. So again, I really just want to emphasize that we can resource these kinds of interventions that build power with youth and within youth, and have that be considered a mental health intervention in the same way sitting for 50 minutes in a therapist's office, and potentially that the interventions that youth are identifying may actually be more effective than traditional clinical mental health services. Next slide. I want to make sure that we leave you all with some action steps for taking our report that I shared in the chat, and that this work that reflects the work that we did in our policy recommendations. Think through how you can put these policy recommendations into action to support eliminating both mental health disparities for young people of color, for marginalized youth, as well as really trying to promote well-being and positive mental health and social emotional development for marginalized young people. It's not just about eliminating mental illness, but it's about promoting health, well-being, and thriving for our young people. Nextly, I did want to draw your attention. Like I said, when we share these slides, we have been aggregating resources, both I think that are unfortunately timely in terms of supporting young people in this current moment, given the violence that Black and Latinx communities have recently experienced related to gun violence. So here are some specific resources that we'd like to share with you. Next slide. And then we have some more general resources for you that are we feel like are culturally responsive, gender affirming. And so you can just click through these slides quickly. Some providers, again, more mental health resources that are community specific. some social media accounts. Youth really wanted to make sure that we knew that they were accessing mental health information online. And that was a big component of how youth supported themselves, is by getting information online. And so I think it's important for us in thinking through how to communicate with youth about their mental health, that we use the avenues that they are comfortable, familiar with, and that are fun for them. So in terms of sort of what is next for this work, here in California, last year, the governor and the legislature approved a $4 billion investment in the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, which is a huge expansion of investments in youth mental health. So we at the Children's Partnership are really working very closely with our state to ensure that that $4 billion really centers equity and really is a way to move some of our policy recommendations in this report forward. There's also national opportunities. So at the recent State of the Union address, President Biden announced a national mental health action plan. And they also recently hosted a youth mental health action summit. And so there are, I think, there's a lot of attention on the current mental health crisis. And I think it's just important to remind policymakers that this crisis has been long brewing, and it has and continues to be most harmful to marginalized youth and their families and communities. And I think that is it. Is that our last slide? Yes, that's it. And so I hope 10 minutes is enough for questions. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Angela, Alexis, and Hermela, for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise. At this time, we will open the floor to questions from attendees. So if you want to put that in the chat box, please do. Oh, and we have one. What are some steps that you recommend when starting peer support groups or having marginalized youth become more involved with policy making and advocacy?
That I can start, and then maybe Alexis or Hermela, if there's anything you want to add, feel free to jump in. So we at the Children's Partnership are not a youth, we're not a grassroots organization, we're not a youth development organization. We're a policy advocacy organization. And so I will say, I'm a social worker, but it's been a really long time since I've worked also directly with youth. So all that to say, recognizing that there were, that we had our strengths in terms of policy advocacy, we know how to do advocacy, that we wanted to ensure that we brought organizations to the table that were youth development organizations that did have an expertise in engaging youth, in working with youth, in supporting youth. And to do that, we were actually in the great position of being able to make grants to each of our 15 partner organizations. And those grants were for stipends for young people. It was really, really important that we compensate youth for their time that they spent on the collective. So I would say ensure that you have a way to compensate young people for volunteering their time and their expertise with you. And then the second piece is I would make sure that you're supporting the adults who are supporting the young people. This can be really difficult work, especially if you're engaging on an issue like mental health, like police violence, like immigration, that I think can be in some ways traumatic for young people to engage with if they're not well supported by adults. And in order to be well supported by adults, you have to make sure that those adults have both their own sort of mental health support system, good supervision, and also that they are compensated as well. And I think I think if you have the expertise, if your organization has the expertise in organizing and youth development and bringing youth together, you know, that I would look for a partner who does sort of advocacy at the state or even local level that you could partner with and think through together sort of how you might develop an advocacy campaign together. So I would use your strengths and identify partners that can complement your own strengths with their expertise. Alexis or Hermela, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I'll just say with like Justice for Black Girls, the organization that I'm with, I found all of the things to apply on that online on Instagram actually. So I think like advertising it in a way that is going to reach youth is really important. Because I think people are looking to get involved, but like we do spend a lot of our time online. So if there's any way that you can reach out to youth online, I think that would be super helpful. And then another thing is just like when I think when groups are made around advocacy, sometimes there's a lot kind of that can go unsaid, but JBG did this really unique thing of like teaching us about Black history and teaching us about, you know, Black philosophers. And we read things like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, and it was really engaging content. So I think along with the advocacy part of it, engaging the youth in their culture and in their history and their content so that they aren't just like advocates, but like well-informed advocates as well, I think is super important. And I think it makes like programs more engaging and easier to be a part of. And kind of like facilitating conversations between youth about like what they want to change and what they want to see become different is through history and like all of the other content. I think that's a really good way to do it as well.
I definitely agree with Hermela and Angela. One thing that I will say is if you are trying to start a peer group through a school, or if youth want to do it via a school, I think the first thing is creating a safe space for them to come together to feel open to state how they're feeling. I think that's one of the biggest things. Just creating that environment. And I also echo the same things that Angela said, that leveraging your strengths and peering up with local community orgs or youth groups that are advocating or are advocates on the local or state level. So definitely agree with you both. Thank you.
Yeah, I could not agree more that connecting with youth and then asking them what they think is so important. Coming in all hot and heavy and just demanding what they think is not going to get us anywhere. We have to build that rapport with them. I also could not agree more that youth need to be paid for their time. Their thoughts are valuable. One more question, I think we have some time. When asking young people what they think in terms of curriculums and policy development and hearing their voice, what do we do when the adults are not listening to them and they're kicking and screaming and just ignoring what young people are saying?
Oh, you know, maybe Hermela, do you have a response? I feel like this is a great one for you to respond to.
Yeah, so I think that ultimately like actions are going to speak louder than words, which is why building rapport with youth in programs is so important. Because I think adults are going to think what they think, and it's not necessarily about convincing adults all the time that we deserve to be listened to. But I think putting that on the table, being like, hey, because of your age, because of where you come from, you may not be listened to. And kind of placing that there at the beginning, knowing that's an obstacle and figuring out how to work not around that, but in spite of that, I think is important. Because yeah, I don't really think there's any way to like engage adults and tell them that what youth have to say is important and make them believe that, other than just telling youth that that's a problem that exists and then doing the work anyway, and then kind of seeing what happens. And I think that most times that has worked the best, where there are a lot of adults who support the work. And so using their resources and the youth's work and the youth's opinions and melding that together to kind of bring together projects like this one is a great way to engage adults. But yeah, I definitely think sometimes when we tell youth that adults might not listen, we then unknowingly center the conversation around adults. And I don't think that we should do that. I think the youth and their experiences and what they want to see happen should be centered first. And then allowing their work and their actions to speak louder than their words, I think, is the next best thing.
That was so beautifully said. I really appreciated what you said about not centering the adults despite that obstacle. So unfortunately, we are out of time. If there are not any more questions, I would like to once again thank you all for being here to learn how to support young people. And thank you again to Children's Partnership for bringing us this wonderful webinar. Please follow them at Kids Partnership or connect with them at their website, which I will put in the chat. And remember that we can all make a difference in young people's lives. And I hope that you apply the strategies that you've learned today. Yeah, if there are any more questions, put them in the chat box and hopefully we can answer them at a later date. Thank you all for your time.